I left my reading glasses at the diner. That's how all of this started. Not with a phone call, not with a lawyer's letter, not with some dramatic confrontation at the front door. Just a pair of drugstore reading glasses I'd left sitting on the table at Merle's Diner on Route 9, right next to the sugar dispenser. Because my son had me so distracted, I walked out without them. We'd had lunch together that Tuesday. My son and I. He drove up from Raleigh, said he had some paperwork he needed me to look over. Something about updating the beneficiary forms on one of my old accounts. I didn't think much of it. He's always been the organized one. Always got his ducks in a row, as his mother used to say. We ate our usual. I had the turkey club. He had the Reuben, and he pushed a few documents across the table, and I signed where he pointed. I trusted him. He was my son. I drove home. Sat down in my recliner. Reached for my glasses to read the mail, and they weren't in my shirt pocket. I retraced my morning in my head and knew immediately. I had set them on the table at Merle's when I was squinting at those documents. Old habit. I take them off when I'm done reading. Set them somewhere. Forget them. My late wife used to tie a cord around them for me. I never bothered after she passed, so I drove back. It's maybe 6 minutes from my house, Merle's. I've been eating there since 1987. Half the staff knows my name. I walked in and the lunch crowd had thinned out. Brenda at the front recognized me right away and said, "Mr. Ron Calloway, your glasses are up here at the host stand." I thanked her and put them in my pocket. I was heading back to the door when one of the younger servers, a girl named Iris, probably 22, 23, stepped out from behind the counter and said, "Sir, can I talk to you for just a second?" Something in her voice stopped me. Not scared, exactly. More like careful. Like she'd been rehearsing what she wanted to say and wasn't sure she'd say it right. I said, "Sure, of course." She asked if we could step into the break room in the back just for a minute. Said it was private. Brenda gave her a look but didn't stop her. The break room at Merle's is not glamorous. A folding table, 4 mismatched chairs, a microwave that smells like somebody heated fish in it once and it never recovered. Iris closed the door and stood there with her arms crossed over her apron, not in an unfriendly way, more like she was holding herself steady. She said, "I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I want you to know that first. I was refilling the coffee at the booth right behind yours, and the divider between the booths has a gap at the top where it doesn't quite meet the ceiling. I could hear everything." I asked her what she heard. She took a breath. "Your son was on his phone while you were in the restroom. Before you came back to the table, he was talking to someone. I don't know who, and I heard him say he needed the accounts transferred before the end of the month. He said." She paused here, looked at the floor for just a second, then back at me. "He said, the old man signed everything. He doesn't read what he's signing anymore. He just trusts me." I stood there. She kept going, because I think if she stopped, she wouldn't start again. And then the other person said something and your son laughed and said, "Don't worry about him. He's 67 and his blood pressure's been through the roof. We just have to wait." And then he said a name. He said a name. He said, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm really sorry." He said, "Evelyn's already on board. She's been on board for 2 years. Evelyn is my daughter-in-law, my son's wife of 11 years. I've known her since she was 29 years old. I watched her walk down the aisle. I held their first baby in the hospital while she was still in recovery. I must have made some kind of sound because Iris reached out and touched my arm for just a second and said, "Do you want to sit down?" I sat down. The chair wobbled. I put my elbows on the folding table and just breathed for a minute. I need to explain something about my situation so the rest of this makes sense. I was married for 31 years to my wife, Ruth. She died of ovarian cancer 8 years ago. Before she passed, we had built a decent amount, not wealthy by any stretch, but we'd been careful. Paid off the house in Winston-Salem. Had a rental property in Greensboro we'd bought back in 1998 that had appreciated significantly. I had a 401k from 30 years at the same manufacturing company, and Ruth had a small life insurance policy that she'd insisted on keeping even when money was tight. When she died, everything came to me. We had it set up that way. Simple, clean. She trusted me, and I trusted her. After Ruth, I was alone for 4 years. Then I met a woman named Beverly at my church's grief support group. We dated for 2 years, got married, and it lasted about 18 months before I realized we both made a mistake. We weren't in love. We were both just lonely and scared, and we'd confused those two things for something they weren't. We separated and divorced with no real bitterness. Beverly moved to Savannah to be near her sister. We don't keep in touch, but I don't wish her anything bad. The divorce was straightforward. We'd kept our finances mostly separate, but Beverly did retain some interest in a joint account we'd opened together, and per our divorce settlement, she was to receive a portion of one of the IRAs that had grown during our marriage. My lawyer at the time had explained it all to me, but honestly, I'll admit this now, I'd nodded along without fully understanding what I'd agreed to. Beverly was a decent woman, and I didn't want to fight over money, so I signed. What I didn't realize until much later, when I was going through documents with a new financial advisor, was that the divorce agreement had left a somewhat ambiguous clause about marital assets accrued during the period of marriage, and that depending on interpretation, it could potentially apply to certain portions of the rental property too. Not clearly, not definitively, but enough that a motivated lawyer could make an argument. My son had known about this for years. He'd helped me organize my files after the divorce. He knew which accounts were in what name, what the property was worth, and exactly what the will said. I'm not a naive man, I want to say that. I'm a retired industrial engineer. I ran a team of 40 people for 12 years. I can read a schematic and I can spot a faulty process, but I trusted my son the way you trust the floor under your feet, without thinking about it, without checking, because it's just always been there. Iris was sitting across from me now. She'd pulled out one of the other chairs and sat down quietly while I processed everything. I asked her, "Did you hear a name on the phone? Did he say who he was talking to?" She thought for a second. "He called her Bev, I think. At one point he said, 'Tell Bev to hold off on calling the title company until I give the signal.'" Bev. Beverly. My ex-wife in Savannah. The woman I divorced 4 years ago and hadn't spoken to since. I don't know how long I sat in that break room. Iris didn't rush me. At one point, our manager knocked on the door and she opened it and said she needed 2 more minutes and he let her have them. Because I think he could see my face and understood something serious was happening. She came back and sat down and just waited. Finally, I asked her, "Why did you tell me this? You didn't have to." She looked at me very directly and said, "My grandfather raised me after my parents split up. He worked 2 jobs and never once made me feel like a burden. If somebody was doing to him what it sounded like was being done to you, I would want someone to tell him." Then she shrugged, like she was almost embarrassed by how simply she'd put it. "That's all." I thanked her. I meant it more than I've meant most things I've said in my life. I drove home. I did not call my son. I sat in my kitchen and I thought about Iris's words very carefully, turning them over like I used to turn over a problem at work, looking at it from every angle before I decided anything. He doesn't read what he's signing anymore. He just trusts me. We just have to wait. Evelyn's already on board. I got up and went to my filing cabinet. It's a 2-drawer metal cabinet in the spare bedroom that Ruth always called the paper graveyard. I found the folder from that Tuesday's lunch, the one my son had brought, 3 pages. I read them slowly, this time with my glasses on. The first page was a legitimate-looking beneficiary change form for an old Fidelity account. My signature was there. The change was from my estate to my son, which honestly I might have agreed to anyway if he'd simply asked me. He is my only child, but I hadn't understood that's what I was signing. The second page was something I hadn't noticed at all in the restaurant. It was a document that appeared to be a quitclaim deed for the Greensboro rental property. My signature was on it. The transfer was to an LLC I didn't recognize, GMC Holdings Group. No address I could identify. The third page was what appeared to be a letter of authorization allowing someone to act as my financial representative for a period of 12 months. My signature was on it. The authorized representative was named as my son. I sat there for a very long time. I'm not a man who panics. I'm also not a man who moves slowly when he sees a faulty process in front of him. The next morning, before I called anyone in my family, I called a real estate attorney in Winston-Salem named Gary Whitfield, who I'd used before, briefly during a property dispute with a neighbor. Gary's office is on 5th Street, and he's been practicing for 30 years, and I trust him because he tells me things I don't want to hear and charges me fairly for the privilege. I was in his office by 10 o'clock. I put the 3 documents on his desk. He read them in silence. Then he read them again. He asked me if I'd known what I was signing. I told him I had not. I told him about lunch, about the glasses, about Iris. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The beneficiary form is signed and submitted, so undoing that will require their cooperation or a legal challenge on grounds of undue influence or incapacity, neither of which is clean. The quitclaim deed is more urgent. If it's been filed with the county, the property transfer may already be recorded. The power of attorney is the most dangerous piece here. We need to revoke that today. Right now, actually. I'm going to have my paralegal draft the revocation while you sit here." While we waited for the revocation document, Gary asked me if I wanted to call the police. I told him I didn't know yet. He said he understood. He also said that what had been described to him sounded like elder financial abuse under North Carolina law, and that if I wanted to pursue it criminally, I had that right. He didn't push me either direction. The revocation was drafted in 20 minutes. I signed it. Gary had it notarized on site and called the county recorder's office while I was still there. The quitclaim deed had been filed 2 days earlier. My son had apparently moved quickly. Gary told me we'd be filing to contest it on the grounds that the signature was obtained through fraud and that I should not sign anything else without running it through him first. I drove home and I sat in my recliner and I did not move for a while. That evening, my son called to check in. He does this most Wednesdays around 7, I answered. We talked for about 10 minutes about normal things, his kids, a baseball game, whether I'd had the furnace inspected before winter. I said I had. I didn't mention Gary Whitfield. I didn't mention the break room at Merle's. I didn't mention Iris. I said goodnight, and I hung up the phone and I sat in the dark for a while. I thought about the summer he was 9 years old. We drove to the Outer Banks, just the 2 of us, because Ruth had a conference she couldn't get out of. We got sunburned the first day, and he cried in the hotel bathroom because his shoulders hurt so much. And I held him and promised it would feel better by morning. I thought about teaching him to drive in the church parking lot on a Sunday afternoon. I thought about the way he'd looked at me in the hospital waiting room when his first son was born. This complicated mix of joy and terror and need, still so much my kid even at 34. And I thought about the fact that he looked at me across a table at Merle's diner and watched me sign documents I didn't understand and said nothing. That he'd called someone, Beverly, my ex-wife, a woman I'd been separated from for 4 years, and coordinated a plan. That he'd told someone on the phone that all they had to do was wait. Wait for my blood pressure to finish what time had started. 2 weeks later, I had a new will drafted by Gary's office. The rental property in Greensboro, once the title dispute was settled, was to remain in my estate. I set up a revocable trust that Gary and a co-trustee would manage with clearly designated distributions. My grandchildren, my son's kids, who had done nothing wrong, would receive educational trust funds for college. The bulk of the estate would go to 3 charities, one for cancer research in Ruth's memory, one for a youth mentorship program in my county, and one I just recently decided to add. That last one was the Iris Foundation, except that's not really what it's called. I don't want to be overly dramatic about it. What I did was contact Merle's Diner and ask to speak with the manager, a man named Phil who's been running the place for almost 15 years. I told him I wanted to do something for one of his employees, and I wanted to do it properly. I set up a direct contribution to a scholarship fund at the community college in her name, enough to cover 2 years of tuition, which is what she'd told me she was saving up for. Phil cried a little on the phone. He said he'd been hoping someone would look out for that girl. As for my son, I called him on a Sunday afternoon, about 3 weeks after that lunch at Merle's. I asked him to drive up. I didn't tell him why. He showed up at my door looking nervous in the way that people look nervous when they don't know exactly what the other person knows. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten breakfast with his mother for 30 years, and I laid the documents out in front of him. I didn't yell. I want to be clear about that. I didn't yell and I didn't cry, though I'd done both in private during those 3 weeks. So I think I'd earned the steadiness. I simply told him what I knew. I told him I knew about Beverly. I told him I'd had a real estate attorney undo the quitclaim deed. I told him the power of attorney had been revoked the day after I found out. He didn't deny it. That surprised me a little, though maybe it shouldn't have. He sat there for a moment and then he put his hands flat on the table and said he was sorry. He said he'd been in financial trouble, real trouble, the kind he'd been too ashamed to tell me about, and that Beverly had reached out to him after the divorce, knowing the outline of my assets, and had suggested they could work together. He said it had seemed practical at the time. He said by the time it stopped seeming practical, he was already in it too deep to see a way out that didn't feel worse. I listened to all of it. Then I told him that I heard him, that I wasn't going to pretend I didn't understand desperation because I'd felt it myself at different points in my life. That I loved him and I would probably continue to love him in the automatic, cellular way that parents love their children, regardless of what they deserve. And then I told him that I would not be pressing criminal charges, but that our relationship, as it had been, the access, the trust, the assumption of good faith, was over. Not forever, necessarily, but for now, and that rebuilding it, if he wanted to, would take years and would have to come entirely from his end. That I couldn't do his work for him. He asked about the kids. I told him the trust for his children was intact. I would not punish my grandchildren for his choices. He nodded. He looked honestly like a man who'd been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had just set it down, which I found both sad and infuriating in equal measure. He drove back to Raleigh. I haven't seen him in person since, though we've spoken briefly on the phone twice. Short calls, careful, like strangers who used to know each other. Beverly. I have not contacted. Gary's office communicated what needed to be communicated through legal channels. I don't have anger toward her the way I might have expected. She was always at her core a practical woman. She saw an opportunity, and she took it. That doesn't make it right. It just makes it less of a surprise. What I think about most, when I think about all of this, is not the legal fight or the documents or even my son's face at that kitchen table. What I think about is Iris, standing in the break room of Merle's diner with her arms crossed over her apron, telling me about her grandfather in a voice that was trying very hard to be matter-of-fact. I could have walked out of that diner in 30 seconds. Grabbed my glasses from the host stand, said thanks to Brenda, driven home. I never would have known. Not until it was too late anyway, until the property was gone and the accounts were drained and I was sitting in my recliner one day trying to understand how the floor had gone out from under me. A pair of drugstore reading glasses left next to a sugar dispenser. I've thought many times about what my wife Ruth would say about all of this. She was a practical woman in the best sense. Not cold, just clear-eyed. I think she would have said something like, well, now you know. And then she probably would have made a pot of coffee and sat down with me at the table and helped me figure out the next step. So that's what I did. I made a pot of coffee. I sat down. I figured out the next step. And I went back to Merle's the following Tuesday. I sat in my usual booth. Not the same one as that lunch with my son, a different one facing the window. Iris brought my coffee without me asking, because she'd already learned that's what I take. I left her a tip that was probably unreasonable by any standard measure, and she looked at it and then looked at me and shook her head like she wanted to argue about it, and I told her not to. She didn't. I drove home. I read my mail with my glasses on. I called Gary to check on the property filing status. That was 3 months ago. The title dispute is still working through the courts, but Gary is confident the trust is in place. My blood pressure, as it happens, has actually gone down since I stopped eating lunch with people who were waiting for it to kill me. I'm 67 years old. I live alone in a house that's paid off. I have grandchildren I intend to watch graduate. I have a regular booth at a diner on Route 9 where a young woman with good values brings me coffee before I have to ask. It's not a perfect life, but it's mine, and I know where everything in it is. That's more than I could say 3 months ago, and I don't intend to forget the difference. I've spent a lot of time these past few months thinking about the word trust. Not in a philosophical way. I'm not that kind of man. More in the way an engineer thinks about a load-bearing beam. You trust it because it's held before, because you built it yourself or you watched it get built, and you know the materials. And then one day, you walk across it and feel it shift under you, and you realize you hadn't actually checked it in years. You just assumed. That's what I'd done with my son. I'd built a picture of him in my mind that I hadn't updated in a long time. The 9-year-old with sunburned shoulders. The nervous father in the hospital waiting room. I kept seeing those versions of him and calling it knowledge. It wasn't knowledge. It was memory. And memory, I've learned, is not the same thing. What I keep coming back to is this. The choices that brought everything to that Tuesday at the diner weren't made in one moment. They were made slowly, over years, in small decisions that each seemed survivable on their own. My son chose to open a door when Beverly reached out. He chose to keep it quiet. He chose to bring documents to a lunch table instead of sitting down and telling me the truth about what he was going through. Each of those choices narrowed the path he was on until there was only one direction left. That's how most damage gets done, not in a single dramatic act, but in a long series of small ones that nobody stops to examine. And I did my part too. I stopped reading what I was signing. I confused familiarity with safety. I let the trust I felt become a substitute for the attention I owed myself. There's no self-pity in saying that, just accuracy. If I'm going to be honest about what happened, I have to be honest about all of it. Iris didn't have to say a word to me. She had nothing to gain and, frankly, something to lose. A potential scene in her workplace. A conversation with her manager. The risk of being wrong or being dismissed. She chose to speak anyway, not because she had a plan or because she expected anything back. She did it because it was the right thing and she knew it, and that was enough for her. I think about that a lot. How rare it is to meet someone whose moral compass is that clean and that quiet, no drama, no performance, just a young woman with her arms crossed over her apron saying, "I thought you should know." That's what integrity looks like when it's real. It doesn't announce itself, it just acts. What I want to say to anyone who sees something of their own life in this story is pay attention, not with suspicion. Suspicion is exhausting and it corrodes everything it touches. But with clarity, read what you sign. Ask questions when something feels off. Don't let love for a child, for anyone, become a reason to stop thinking. Love and discernment are not opposites. You can hold both. I'm 67. I still have time to be careful, to rebuild what needs rebuilding, to leave something behind that reflects what I actually value. The trust is set up. The property fight is moving through the courts. My grandchildren will go to college. And every Tuesday, I sit in a booth at Merle's on Route 9 and the young woman brings me coffee before I have to ask. That's enough. That's more than enough.